Hey everybody, thank you for hanging out today for a little discussion about composition. This is one of my favorite things to talk about because composition makes such a huge difference in your illustrations and in your artwork. If you've never thought about it before, or maybe you've thought about it but not really understood how to go about understanding it better, we're going to cover that today because the good news is there are a few really basic things that you can apply right out of the gate, right off the bat, with any new drawing that you're doing, with any new illustration, that will lead to a much more successful image. And these are not really tricky rules to follow. And I say rules, but I want to be careful about that because with composition, it's not like there are really hard, fast rules so much as there are some guidelines and some principles that are worth considering. But as any artist will tell you, people break these rules all the time and still get great results. However, I would say that the people who are breaking the rules are probably quite aware of what these principles are, and they're being very creative about how they go about manipulating you, the viewer, in the way that they break those rules to really force you to see what they want you to see, or to do it in a kind of a creative way that really makes sense for whatever that image is trying to do, trying to accomplish. So let's say hello to some folks in the chat. Alrighty, we have today Raunak, nice to see you, and Steve, and Sam, and Mike. Good evening, everybody. Ariana, Cornell, and Jay. Nice to see you all. Thanks for hanging out. All right, now let's get started. So the first thing I wanted to do was talk about really the hierarchy of things with composition. And the way to think about this is sort of like a pyramid, if you like, or if you want to look at it that way, I would start with the most important thing, which is the base. And most people would say that the base of your composition is either going to be the structure or the focal point. I think that those are kind of equally balanced, but I sometimes lean a little bit more towards structure than focal point myself. So you could argue about that all day long. The main thing is, though, the structure, the sort of weight of your composition has to be managed carefully, and you have to prioritize what you're putting into your image. So let me just show you a few examples of some illustrations that I love, some paintings that I love, and I want to talk about first structure here. And I'll just hide my brushes here for a moment. So we're going to start here with these two illustrations. We have an Andrew Wyeth here on the left, and then a William Bouguereau on the right, two of my favorite artists. And I want you to look at these two illustrations, and we're just going to talk a little bit about how they are composed and how they're put together, and what the artist probably was thinking about in the way that they were arranging the elements of this picture. And I'm just going to turn on something here first, and that is this grid I've overlaid over each of these illustrations. And what this grid is showing us is thirds. Okay, so we have a row of 3 and 3, columns of 3 and 3 rows of 3. So we're evenly breaking up the image into thirds. And the reason for this is one of those really handy tricks that you can apply with your artwork. Even right out of the gate when you're sketching, if you're just trying to come up with an illustration, trying to come up with an idea, you could go ahead and start your illustration like so. You could have thirds placed in your canvas like this. So this is if I were doing thumbnails, right? And thumbnail sketching is a really, really excellent way to work out composition because you're not going to get bogged down in details, and you're going to be thinking about large shapes, medium shapes, small shapes, but mostly the large and the medium and the rhythm that you're trying to create within the illustration, as well as how you're trying to guide the viewer's eye. All right, so I will often do this. I will actually make myself a little gridded thumbnail rectangle like this, and then draw inside of it. And this helps me to work out useful compositions much more quickly than if I were to not go ahead and subdivide like this. All right, so we'll come back to that, but first I want to look at these drawings here, and 1 second here. There we go. So we're going to take a look at the Wyeth on the left first. And I want you to notice that this has strong vertical elements in it, right? There's a vertical rhythm to this. We have these straight up and down lines. I'm going to draw on top of this so you can see. All right, so just bear with me. I'm going to just put a little overlay there. All righty. And I want you to just look at this these strong vertical rhythms. Here's this figure stood straight up, right? This figure in the background straight up, and this trunk of this big tree, and then we have more of this. Now, one of the things you could call this is repetition or echoing or rhythms. It depends on who you're talking to, but they all mean the same thing, which is that you are repeating a sort of a thematic element, a visual element. You're using that repetition to your advantage to create a sort of a rhythm in the piece. And here we have this rhythm that is very vertical, right? It's straight up and down. Now, the problem with this would be if it were only to have those vertical rhythms and there was no interruption in it, what you would wind up with is something that's really quite static and boring and not all that interesting to look at, frankly. And so Wyeth, what he does in order to direct our eye to our focal point, right? And here's one of those focal points. And I want to talk about with focal point again, another hierarchy. And you have to think about what is it you want your viewer to see first. Normally, you're not going to give totally equal weight to one focal point and another. You're going to want to have one focal point be sort of stronger and more obvious for a place for your eyes to land than another. And so I would argue, of course, that the second focal point is this figure here. Why? Well, because one of the things about focal points is if you put any human element in an illustration. So let's say I put a landscape on the page and there's nothing there other than the grass, the sky, the trees, and the mountains. And then I put one tiny little figure right down in the bottom right corner. Well, we as humans are just going to naturally gravitate towards that figure, and that will become our focal point, at least temporarily, because we can't help ourselves. This is just a rule, and this is how it works. So one of the things you can do for a focal element is to have a human figure or a face in an illustration. Second to that would be any kind of living creature. It just happens to work that way. So anyway, coming back to this Wyeth, our first focal point, the reason we're able to establish that this is where we want to have our eyes go first, so let me just hide the grid for a moment here. The reason we're able to establish that this is where we want our eyes to go first is this has the highest amount of contrast, okay, in this entire illustration. Look at the white of the shirt. I'm just going to outline this area here. All right, now, the white of the shirt against the darkness of this shadow right here, and the coat, the shadow that's falling on him from the tree, right? And then we have the shadow next to the head. What's happening is the whiteness of the coat and this silhouette of the human head, okay? And let's be really clear about this. Notice that the hair is the same hue, saturation, and value as the tree, more or less. What does that do? Well, it forces me to come in here and follow this shadow right there, okay? That's being cast onto the face, and then come around, and this becomes the shape that I am really focused on right here, okay? And that is the highest area of contrast. It's also a human element. And so I come here and I say, okay, now what's he looking at? So because he's looking in this direction, naturally my eye is going to travel to this direction, and then we're going to find this guy. What are some of the things that Wyeth is doing to guide our eyes? Well, this is one of the things that you can do in your illustration called a guiding line. Guiding lines are quite literally guiding lines in your illustration that direct the viewer to what it is that you think is important in your illustration. So what's really cool about this is you can see that the slope of the shoulder here combined with the shadow, because these are the same value, dark, 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 right? The shadow here and the shadow of the tree, this is creating a diagonal straight towards this guy, right? And look at this. Look at this shadow here connecting down with this limb. Okay, that's pushing us into this space as well. Very intentional. If you look at the cut of his coat here, right? This ellipse, part of an ellipse, excuse me, right? If I were to follow that rhythm up, it's going to connect me here to where this value here changes from darker to lighter with that blue, and right up into this figure, and then bam, here we are where we need to be. And that's our secondary focal point. And so what he's also doing, as I mentioned earlier, is the rhythms that we have that are very vertical, these straight up and downs. Well, to interrupt these and add interest, as well as to keep our eyes from traveling up, off, and out of the image, which we do not want, we always want to bring ourselves back to what needs to be focused on, right? So that's why we have these branches here interrupting that strong vertical, right? And then we have these nice negative space shapes, all of them different, right? If there was some repetition in there, that would not be as interesting. You need asymmetrical balance. You need variation and variety in your shapes and the sizes of those shapes. But generally speaking, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to block off that area, okay? And now, if our eye comes up here and we say, oh, we're traveling off, no, don't worry. You're going to get interrupted, right, several times, and it's going to slow you down and push you back to where you need to go, right? Thanks to this shadow shape here. Everything is moving me towards where I need to be. And the same over here. We're going to interrupt here so that I don't travel through this light value all the way up and out of the picture. No, instead, I'm going to follow that value. I get interrupted here. I'm going to still pick it up here. But then look what it does. It forces me up this way to connect with it again. And then I've got this nice loop happening. Or I can follow it around and here because that's where that value gets picked up again and that nice color. So this is all really, really well played by our friend N.C. Wyeth. Now, where else is there an element of contrast that provides me with a third focal point? Well, let me just remove all this for a moment. I want you to see what happens down here. Aha. So that is framed really nicely by the shadow shapes around that hand. And we can make out the handle of an axe, and then we don't even need to see the rest. We are picking up immediately what the vibe is here, right? Violence, okay? This guy is either going to take care of that cat, all right, or he's at least going to protect himself if this guy comes after him. But we're getting a nice sense of impending, scary stuff here. And all of that is helped, of course, by, if I'll just turn off this overlay for a moment, another element of composition, of course, is going to be more of the technical stuff where we get into color, right? Color and how you use color. So what's really great about this is the complementary colors we're seeing in play here, right? We've got the blues and the purples, and then look at this one big hit of yellow, right? Were it not for this hit of yellow, and it's really the only one we see throughout the composition, with the exception of this being a little more muted over here in the tree branches, right? But were it not for that, it would also not guide our eyes to this area as quickly and up to the face. None of this is an accident, right? But really nice use of color there. And then when you look at the shadow shapes and the values, what I like to do is this here. I just take this image and blur it out a little bit. Okay, now that I've removed a lot of the detail, you can really easily see how much of that focal point is clear and obvious to us because of the contrast. So I'll pause for just a moment because I'm talking a lot, and I want to see if anybody has any questions about this or any comments. All right, let's see here. Hey, nice to see you. Composition has always been an area I struggle with, says Ariana. Well, today, Ariana, I think we're gonna get you on the road to happiness with composition and a better understanding of it. And also, there's nothing to be fearful about. There are a couple of simple things you can notice in your illustrations after you watch this masterclass that I hope you will be able to more quickly pinpoint as areas that could be fixed, ways to improve how you're guiding your viewer's eye to what it is that you think is important in your illustration. And there's a lot to cover today, and I'll do my best to try and simplify all of it and let you have a nice takeaway that you can work on. Hey, Sam, glad you're here. Yeah, it'd be nice if everyone could say where they're coming from. Uruguay, cool, nice. I love it. Anyway, okay, thank you. I'm glad you're liking this, Ariana. That's very nice. If anybody has any questions, I'll check the chat periodically and we'll see what's up. Hey, United Arab Emirates, very cool. Hi, Mohammed, nice to see you. All right, gang, so I'm just going to turn off this layer again. We'll come back to the original because I want to push it on over here to this William Bouguereau. Now, sometimes people think that with composition, there has to be some really dynamic element or things have to be, there has to be energy and a lot of that. Well, actually, a lot of that is actually happening in this image, but it's very calm, it's very quiet. Divisions of thirds, the rule of thirds in your compositions is you'll find that if you place elements that you find to be relatively important, or if you divide up the areas of your composition along these thirds, you will oftentimes wind up with something that's pretty effective. Notice how his head is actually sitting on this third right here. Okay, that's no accident, right? Were he placed dead center like this with the figure coming down this way, well, what we'd get then, just make that a little lighter, if we had the figure here, okay, well, we're going to have all this space to deal with up here, and it's going to make it pretty bottom heavy, okay? So that's one thing. And you'll notice, too, that he's very smart about taking all this area down here and putting it in shadow, so good move there. But I want to come over to this Bouguereau here. Bouguereau, I'm not sure how you say it. Je parle français, mais je ne sais pas comment prononcer ce nom. Excuse-moi. All right, so here we go. Let's check out this cat because this is quite a beautiful piece. Now I've got my thirds here, and I'm going to leave them there for just a moment, and I'm turning the overlay on. Alrighty. And let's just draw over this for a moment. Now, of course, let's look at our rule of thirds. What do we have here? This is definitely the area we want to focus on. Look at how the child is lit, okay? Do you think it's an accident that there's this massive highlight on her entire forehead? No, certainly not. I mean, her face is lit more than anything else in this illustration, right? Certainly no accident. Of course, we're going to go straight there. Look at the arrangement of these faces together. Now, it would be terribly boring if the girl had been in a perfect silhouette, but she's not. She's at a extreme three-quarter view. Okay, the woman in a perfect silhouette, her face more in shadow. The angle of her face, okay, connecting with the angle of this girl's face. That's such a nice arrangement there. But look, there's also a little bit of overlap, okay, so that we have the hair coming behind the nose. So there isn't this sort of feeling of a tangent. And tangents are something you want to avoid as much as you possibly can whenever you have overlapping elements in an illustration. And I'll just, for a moment, I'm going to hide this because I want to draw you one of my favorite examples of a tangent so it's easy to understand. So if I have a house sitting in a landscape, okay, and I want to put a mountain behind it, well, what happens if I do this? Here's my mountain, and okay, there's the rest of my mountain. All right, here's the rest of my picture. Now, why is that problematic? Well, look at what happened. The mountain, which is supposed to be behind the house, right, is touching right here on the roof. And what you automatically wind up with is a very flattened image, okay? This line connects with that line, this edge connects with that edge. We don't know what's in front of what, and this is not going to work. So instead, what do? I'll draw this again, okay. What do? Well, you could do this, da-da-da-da-da-da. Okay, well, that's a little better. You could also do this. Ah, okay. Now I understand that this object here is in front of those mountains. Now, of course, there are other things you're going to be able to do to push those mountains back, and that would be using a lighter value, using a cooler color. If you're doing a landscape, you want your warmer, more saturated colors in the foreground. And because of atmospheric, what is it called? Atmospheric distortion, or I can't remember the term right now. Anything in the background is going to get pushed back. It's going to get a little cooler. Alrighty. So anyway, avoid tangents. They're terrible, right? Another example. What happens if you have somebody who is just standing around, right? And he's got his hand in his pocket. All right. And I'm going to put a car right behind him, okay? All right, here's that car. Wow. Terrible tangent, right? Look at that. What happens? Now we get the impression, holy cow, is this guy massive? Is he just an enormous human being? No, but if we do this, okay, and we understand, oh, okay, never mind. That car is behind him. We're in good shape. Okay? That makes all the difference. So tangents, bad. Try and avoid them. Now, I've seen some artists go ahead and use tangents in their work, and they get away with it because they're absolute geniuses. Norman Rockwell, for example, has some great examples of some super bad tangents that you don't even notice. He just manages to take care of it with the composition and with other tricks that he uses. But yeah, try to avoid those. All right, back to this wonderful Bouguereau. All right, so we're looking at our focal point here, right? Now, how do I get here in this illustration? Well, let's look at these lines, these guiding lines that we have that are so useful in this illustration for us here. All right, now starting with this bottom left corner. By the way, photographers have been using this trick ever since photography came to be, and painters have been using it. There is something about leading the eye into your illustration from the bottom left corner. If anybody can tell me in the chat what it is, I'd love to know. I've been told this since day one, and I've never really heard a great reason for why this is, but it does happen to work. It's just one of those things that works. So let's look at, first of all, look at all these lines. I'm just coming right on up. Everything is just telling me, go this way, go this way. Look at this. Come on up. This is where the fun is, up here to the faces, right? Everything is guiding me in that direction. Look at this arm. Ah, here's where you want to be. right? I come around this big shape, and what happens? I get back here. And why? Well, look, dark. A little bit of highlights in the hair, but this whole dark shape just blends into one. And I just come to where the highest amount of contrast is. Again, high contrast is going to be a place where your eyes just naturally go. It's biological. We can't help it, right? This is a survival thing. Just the way it is. Okay, so everything is put. Look at this little detail here, right? I have no idea what this stick is in the background, okay? Whatever that stick is, what is it doing? It is pointing me straight towards where I want to be, right? Where the subject matter is. Okay, so this is really an amazing use of all these wonderful action lines, these guiding lines, getting me to where I want to be. Very nicely done. All right, now what's another thing that's going on here? Okay, let's look at the hands, okay? I just want to turn off the thirds here for just a moment. First of all, these hands are just beautifully painted, absolutely gorgeous. All right, but here this hand is turning, bend at the knuckles right here towards where we want to be. And what happens here as the hand turns away? Cast into shadow, right? So again, I pick up a little highlight here. It's directing my eye exactly where I want to be. The shapes of these hands are exquisite. These are just beautifully painted hands, right? And there's a nice echo here between this hand and this hand with that separation of the forefinger, the two middle fingers, and then the pinky. Same over here. Right, that's just an absolutely gorgeous configuration of those fingers, right? And I also want to just point you to what happens when you have an illustration like this that feels fairly centered, right? I mean, the structure, if you want to look at the structure of this, it feels quite grounded, it feels very stable, and that is going to support the theme that we're seeing here, the love of a mother and a daughter, or maybe it's an older sister, I don't know, but I believe it's a mother and a daughter. To support that theme, we have this nice feeling of stability in the illustration. There's a feeling of calm. And one of the things about calm is that you can achieve it with guiding lines that are more fluid and more curvilinear. That can help if you're using them also in the rest of the structure of the painting feels, or the illustration feels very balanced in a grounded way. And how does this feel grounded? Well, look, the base of our illustration, okay, is wide. And up here, what we have is a triangle, okay? So the triangle is a very, very famous way of, an old and famous and well-known way of arranging your picture so that you feel stability, right? Because the base is wide. We come to our focal point here that's more narrow at the top. But this is helping a lot. And then it's all these lovely curvilinear lines that are helping guide us to where we want to be, right? And that's a really peaceful and calming effect. I want you to also notice in the background, what's really wonderful about this is the contrast between this curvilinear action here, and then here we have more of this straight, more structured, more angular, pardon me, arrangement of shapes, right? So that's really quite nice as well. Lots to talk about with this, but I do want to move on, so we're going to do that. All right, so let's take a look now at this wyeth on the left. All right, so we're looking at some different examples of different kinds of composition. Now, the one on the left here, this wyeth, this is all about movement. And one of the ways you achieve movement in an illustration is with diagonals, right? Diagonal lines, diagonal movement in the illustration is going to help with this sense of action and with things moving, and it's going to kill that stability, that feeling of calm and serenity, okay? So why don't we take a look at this? All right, now, I'm going to turn the thirds on here too, because again, it's always worth looking at how these are subdivided. And sure enough, what do we see? Right here, at the intersection of those lines for our thirds, as I mentioned, it's like point A, point B. Any of these is going to be a great spot for you to center that focal point. But look right here, what do we have? Okay, tremendous contrast. What's over here? This big black coat or vest or whatever he's got there, right? Put the overlay on so you can see this, what I'm doing here. So this is all super dark. Okay, and what do we have here? A nice bright shape connecting that face to that arm and that torso. And this dark shape, again, framing nicely that top part of the face. All right. But anyway, you're getting it right here. This is our area, and we're just centering around there for that focal point. Now let's look at all the rhythms that are repeating here, okay, and reinforcing this forward momentum, this forward motion that we're feeling. Look at the clouds. What are they doing? They are moving from bottom left all the way through the image behind that giant, okay, and that is just forcing us to feel that way. Oh, we are moving, we are moving, we are moving, okay, and that's just guiding the eye straight up there. All right, now, of course, these figures are running in action poses, right? Notice how, for the most part, their faces are cast in shadow or not very well defined. Why is that? Well, we don't want to rest too long on them. We want to come up here and say, holy cow, who's this massive giant figure here? That's what we want to pay attention to, all right? But let's look at some ways that we balance this. Okay, now, in this top third where we have our focal point, instead of leaving all this empty, right, we've got to get some shapes in there. And so I love that we have this small bump here, medium, large, medium, and then off to the left. Why is it important to do this? All right, so anything you're drawing that could potentially be repetitive, unless you're very intentional about it being repetitive, and that's your goal. You want to use that repetition to your advantage as a way to either guide the eye or as a way to keep things calm and not so noticeable, not so interesting perhaps, or even as just a way to add pattern in an area that otherwise doesn't have a lot of interest. Whatever your purpose is, I would say, unless it's totally intentional, you need to avoid it at all costs, because the best thing you can do is use a variety of shapes and a variety of angles and a variety of things like that when you're describing things like this, such as a cloud. So this mass up here, this shape, is so dynamic and so interesting because all of these are different size bumps, right? Moving in different directions, okay? And that kind of variety keeps me engaged and breaks up this sky space here, okay? I just block that off, okay? What does that do? That itself, if I were to just isolate it as a shape, is a very interesting and dynamic shape. And that's no accident, okay? Now, what if he had just done this? Okay, we'll just go stepping back here a moment. What if he had done this? 1, 2, 3. Okay, or even I try to make it as symmetrical as possible here. 1 and 2 and 3. What is the difference? Immediately you can see a difference. Look at how different that illustration would be with that cloud shape at the top. It just kills the energy. It kills that dynamic movement. It kills that diagonal feeling that we have of moving in this direction, doesn't it? That is not really what we want. So I think that that's a pretty noticeable thing worth pointing out. I want to point out something else about the taking liberties with your art and deciding when not to paint something. Let's look down here. I'm going to turn off this overlay for a moment. We have these figures, okay? Now they're clustered together perfectly. And this is another thing you can do is when you have a group of objects, sometimes it's really helpful to find a way to unite them into more of a singular grouping, right? This comes down to structure big time. Is how you arrange different elements into more of a solid shape or into a grouping that feels like it's got its own sort of set of qualities and things like that in the image. Because really, if you look at this painting, this is kind of an element, right? And then this is an element. And then you have some smaller elements here, our background, right? But that's really how it's arranged. It's not like I'm looking at it and stepping back and going 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, there are 4 people there, but look at how each of them overlaps and connects to the next person. See that? That is no accident, believe you me. But I want to point out what was important about not painting, okay? Look at this foot. Great, this foot is planted. Now we know that this foot is back behind these figures. Why do you suppose Wyeth used this nice plume of dust and smoke here just behind these figures? Why would he do that to cover up that foot and not paint that foot? What would be the point of that? Well, I'll tell you, if he were to have placed that foot behind these figures without that nice cloud of dust, we would have had a serious problem with all of these shapes in and around the figures, the shape of the foot, the overlapping. There would be a tremendous mess to try and sort out and compose. The fact that those tones that he's using for the skin tone, right? The color is so close in value and in hue to the tone of the skin of this man here and this man here. All those colors would have been kind of blended together. What he's doing is by eliminating it and covering it with that dust, he's able to then isolate these figures in a way that they read very clearly with their silhouette here. All of these silhouettes, okay, are super easy for us to see. Even if I were to go really jumping back to a distance like this, okay, and just look at the painting really small, I can still clearly see these legs. I can see that definition. I can see everything that's happening. Now, if there were a foot back there that was the same value and the same color, with the same contrast more or less, right behind them, not a great idea, not a great solution. But the thing is, you are the artist and you can choose when to make these decisions, okay? And that's a really wonderful thing. Now, we've already talked about, what happens with these lines of action. We can clearly see that, of course, the leg here, we're getting ourselves up towards where we want to be with these legs, right? The cloud's doing a great job of reinforcing that directional movement. The landscape, why keep the landscape so incredibly simple with what are predominantly just solid colors? Because you don't want to distract from what's happening here in the foreground, because this is really what's exciting about the illustration. You still want to provide some context, okay, which he's doing, right? But to add a whole bunch of detail in here would be distracting. It would not in any way help to tell the story of this illustration. I just need to have a suggestion of where we are. I don't need to see much more than that. All right, now let's move on to this beautiful Thomas Blackshear here at the top right. This Thomas Blackshear painting, absolutely gorgeous. You'll notice right away we have a cool juxtaposition of one figure. Just do this. One figure is straight up and down, solid as a rock, could not be more vertical, okay? But what do we have moving across? Look at this. All these geese flying and providing this really, really cool contrast to that stoic, grounded figure, yeah? This is a pretty interesting way to do this. So let's take a look at, though, what he's doing to get our eye here. Now, naturally, human face. Okay, we're already in good shape there. We're going to go there, okay? But there's a lot more to it than that. Why put this goose here in the extreme foreground? Why put this goose in a darkened position, like there's a shadow cast over it? Why do that? What if this goose was just super bright? I mean, what would that look like? We'll just do this really quickly here. So I'm just going to take this goose and just brighten him up. Look at that. Nice bright goose. All right, so I popped that shape in there now, and, well, what happens? What happens to our focal point? What happens to our composition when we see that bright goose? Immediately we go, oh, what's that? Looks like a bright goose. That would not work. So we have to use that dark shape, that dark silhouette, so that we're moving towards the area of highest contrast and towards our focal point, which is this Native American chief, I would say. And let's look also at, I don't want to get too much into color because I'd like to do more color conversations in the future for these master classes, but just a quick note. There's nothing simpler than taking two complementary colors and just using them all over your illustration. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's not a cheat. Hey, use what works. And this sure does work. I mean, look at it. The oranges and the blues and purples and the yellows, I mean, these are complementary colors and some of the best, right? And the only area we see anything that kind of veers away from that is right here. We got some hits of red. So naturally, we're going to go to where those unique colors are, right? And that is a really smart move. So I think, we can also look at the thirds here. I'll just turn those on for a moment. And holy cow, lo and behold, what do you see here? Bam, right on that spot. There is our focal point. There's no mystery about it there. Thomas Blackshear is playing by the rules, so to speak, and he's doing it in such an incredibly cool way by having this figure that is just straight up and down, this vertical, strong, planted right in the composition, and then this feeling of movement all around him. Really, really cool. One of my favorites. All right, so let's go here then. down to this beautiful Ian McHugh illustration. Ian, a concept artist, one of my favorites, and maybe one of yours as well. If not, check him out, and check out Thomas too. These cats are still alive and well and with us today, which is wonderful. I'll turn off the thirds here for a moment. So here we have this cool fantasy cityscape of some kind, right? Now, even though this is not very detailed, it's actually quite rough if you really take a look at it. We have all that we need to know about what's going on here, and we have a very, very clear idea of foreground, middle ground, background, right? And what I like about this is Ian is breaking one of the rules that most people would say, oh, you can't do that. And yet it works. Here he's got high contrast for this top of this tower here. All right, now normally what you'd say is, well, that's definitely in the distance. It's off in the distance. Therefore, it shouldn't have as much contrast as the elements in the foreground. However, the way he's accomplishing this is, if you look at this area here, okay, let me just turn on that overlay for a moment. If you look here, all right, the area that separates this foreground element, okay, whatever it is, this pile of junk or whatever it might be, okay, if you separate that, this area here, okay, has that nice haze in it, that atmospheric haze, where he is adding a haze to separate it from the foreground and push it back in space. And so by doing so, just by adding a little bit of that there, you can move gradually up towards higher contrast up here. And because it's still part of this shape and part of this area of the painting, you are still going to accept that it is farther back. Also because of the shapes that we're seeing. We know that's a dome. We know these are spires and domes and so on. So we just automatically associate those shapes with architecture and with buildings, and buildings are larger than we are. And so by seeing it at this scale, we push it back with our eyes, and that works. What about these patterns of smoke? Are they accidental? Well, certainly not. Certainly not. What are they doing? They're pushing us to where we want to go, aren't they? Right? That is definitely not an accident. I want to move this way. I want to move that way. Why are these airships in this configuration? Why? Because they angle me towards my focal point. Certainly no accident. Okay, and not only that, but let's take a look at these airships. If these were gone, okay, let's just try something here. What happens to the painting? You lose the human element immediately. All you see is the landscape and the architecture and everything, but you lose the human element because the airships you assume are piloted by people. Not only that, but they add interest up here in this top right area. So we'll just go back. The airships return, and what happens? Now we know there are people involved, okay? And we can also get ourselves heading this way, and we can add some interest up here just to make things not so empty up in that top right corner. All right, so there you go. I'll pause for a moment and see if we have any questions, because then I want to head over to a painting everybody has seen, the Mona Lisa, and I just want to do a quick look at this one, because you have to realize people have been using these methods for 400 years, and they're still going strong, right? Still going strong. All right, so let's see if we have any questions here already. Oh, and we have more people joining us from New Zealand. Cool. Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Neato, Utah, Howard Lyon. That can't be the Howard Lyon. If that's the Howard Lyon, then why am I teaching this class? Good gracious. Howard, why don't you come over here and just fly out here to North Carolina and teach this for me? And throw in some good ideas here in the chat if you wouldn't mind. Hey, Kyle, how would you explain why the bush on the bottom left is bright and detailed in the Wyeth painting? Let's jump back to that for a moment. There we go. All right, let's look at that Wyeth painting. Let me open this up. Hello, overlay, you're gone. Okay. Well, I'll tell you a couple of theories, all right? One, if you look at the shadow shape here, underlying that bright area, what does it do? The shadow shape, if I'll just grab a bright color here so I can point. This shadow shape, if I trace it along, brings me right to that axe. Okay, that would be my first guess. All right, this is a great little visual cue saying, hey, everybody, look at that. Okay, in case you missed it, in case you're too busy looking at this handsome fella and this nasty British soldier back here, you might want to come over here and go, whoop, there's something I need to look at. So that'd be one thing. Another reason, I don't know, could just be a nice little area of detail to paint so things don't get too boring or too symmetrical. Well, that's happening over here. That could be something. Sure. Those are my two guesses right off the top of my head. I wish Wyatt were here now so I could ask him that question. I guarantee you it's not an accident, right? Why would I ever make an illustration like this and say, I think I'll spend some time on these leaves and give them some punch, make them saturated? I don't think that's an accident. I think we're using that shadow to come straight here to this weapon of destruction. Okay, so there you go. Hope that answers that question. Of course, that's just my theory, but you know. Alrighty, let's take a look at this classic piece of work. Alrighty, and then we'll do a little drawing. Okay, we've got just enough time. So here we are. We're looking at the Mona Lisa. Folks, here we have again a what? We have a triangle, right? Nice and stable. Perfecto. Okay, so that's giving us what we want with that. Our focal element. What is our focal element? Well, of course, it's a face. But why do we know that? Well, first of all, let's look at how that's framed by the dress and the hair. What do you see? Dress, brown, value is dark, hair, value dark. It's all one shape, guys, right? What's happening? We're getting basically an informal framing element for that face and for the neck and chest, okay? And when we talk about framing, well, there are formal framing elements you could use in an illustration, such as somebody standing in a doorway or a window in a painting. Look at that Edward Hopper, right, with at the diner at night. Okay, there's kind of a framing element if you want to look at it that way. You could also have an illustration where, for example, let's say you have a scene with a forest, okay, and you got some trees and some foliage is like this, and that's all dense on this side. Big tree here in the foreground. Okay, and there's another branch here, and then more foliage, more foliage, more foliage, right? And this is all dark in the foreground, and we're leading into the light, and then here in this little clearing, what do we have? Well, you have a little house. Okay, now what's happening here? Well, what we're doing is we're creating an informal framing element for this so that this area becomes our framing device, okay? The area that is the negative space created by those trees. All right, so anyway, that's what we got going on here with this face. Fantastic. Let's look at how we bounce back and forth between the two areas of interest in this painting, the hands and the face. Look at this. I'll throw some thirds on there, okay? These are going to be rough. I'm just going to kind of guess at it. 1 and 2, okay. Yep, okay, close enough. And I want you to notice, okay, upper third, action, lower third, action. How do we connect them? Well, we travel up and over, thanks to what's happening with this lovely shawl or this wrap of some kind, right? We're traveling up from the hands. And by the way, these hands are just incredible. Look at the position of these hands. Okay, no accident, no accident. Every finger, all right? Soft, really beautiful organic shapes, right? Look at that's just gorgeous. This one finger popping up forward like that. Not only is that a natural thing to do, but to accentuate that, we do not have what I would call like, sausage fingers. We don't go 1, 2, 3, 4. Hey, fingers, there, done, Simpson style. No, every finger has its own rhythm going on, its own set of shapes, right? And that's what makes it interesting, varying the shapes. What about this little separation of the forefinger and the middle finger? That's just a nice little piece of work there. Great touch. But anyway, what happens here with this shawl or this coat? Okay, what happens? We go up, and we connect, bam, high area of contrast, up to the face. Okay, now let's quickly look at the background because people often miss this. But the background, look at all the asymmetry we got going on. This is a centered piece, right? It's very everything's in the middle, right? You could argue that it's very symmetrical. Well, no, let's be careful about that because look at this pathway back here, this set of rocks back here. Is any of that echoed over here apart from a little bit of color? Certainly not. We have a nice break right here with a little bridge. Okay, over some water, and this looks nothing like this. Okay, why? Why take all the time to make this element so different from this element? This shape right here and this shape right here are not the same, okay? And then bam, we throw in that because that's the asymmetrical balance that keeps this from being so centered that it becomes boring and has no animation, no movement, and no interest for the viewer if they were to take their time to move back here into the background away from our focal point. There's a lot more to talk about with this, but hey, don't have all day. I just want to point out that even a classic piece like this, a piece that has been admired and studied for so many years, is taking advantage of a lot of these old tricks, so to speak. Okay. All right, now there's one that I haven't mentioned, and I kind of always feel a little funny talking about it. We've talked about with the symmetry and the rule of thirds, this pyramid structure. Some people like to go on and on about the golden ratio. Listen, the golden ratio, yes, indeed, you can stick it on top of lots of paintings and lots of drawings and say, look, it fits the golden ratio. And yes, the golden ratio, as it's found in nature, can lead to a really, really pleasing design. I'm not going to dispute that one bit. I would say, though, that trying to work around a composition with it all the time and using it as a sort of a crutch, if you will limit what's possible with you, exploring different things. Like, I mean, if you were to try and apply that golden ratio to that original Wyeth we looked at, it'd probably not work very well, okay, for example. And there are lots of cases where that's not the case, where that doesn't work so well. So I would say it's interesting to look at. Go ahead and look it up, by the way, the golden ratio, the golden mean, I think is another way people say it. And you'll find that it's a square with, you take a square and you take 1/6 of that, 0.6, so 5, 6, wait, I can't do math. So you go to half the square and you add 1 more sixth, basically. And that's the distance that you get with a rectangle. And you just keep repeating that rectangle, and you're going to get some interesting stuff. If I were just to draw it, it's easier. So square. All right, here's half the square. So that's about like maybe 1/6. So this distance here, you just tack on next to it, okay, like that. Then you do the same thing with this one. You go, okay, there's my square. Okay, then you do the same thing, and you turn it. You keep rotating it, right, counterclockwise or clockwise, right? So there's one, and you come down to this one. You do the same subdivision again. Okay, so that's a square, 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 square. Okay, and you keep subdividing, and what you eventually get is this spiraling kind of thing, and that's the golden ratio. So it's worth looking at. It's kind of fun, and some people might say I'm poo-pooing it. I'm not, but All right, so quickly, I want to talk about storytelling. So here's an illustration I did to prep for this, just to show you what happens when I have two people sitting in a room here, or some cafe or restaurant, whatever this is, and they're just opposite one another like this, and they're looking at each other, and there's all kinds of symmetry. Which tells more of a story for me that I think, oh, I want to know what's going on, or what's the dynamic, what's the relationship between these two people, which has more energy, more life? Well, I would argue that it would be this one. So think about camera angle when you do your drawings. Think about the story you're trying to tell. Is there a character in your story who has more power in the relationship than another character? Is there a character who is weaker? Is there a character who's in danger? Is there a character who is the hero? There are lots of ways to do this with camera angle and not being afraid to play with perspective. Now, the thing about this is you really want to go back to, just jump back here, you want to go back to this. You want to go back to a place where you can draw small, okay? Because, I'll switch it up here and just grab my Adobe Live brush. All right, so if I'm thinking about composition, I say, okay, figure, sitting at a table, figure, okay, sitting at a table, they're having some coffee or whatever. All right, so I could vary these poses or whatever, and that's fine. I could do this, and I could say, all right, and maybe there's like a little counter back here, or some shelving, I don't know what, doesn't matter. Maybe there's a window framing them or something like that. Okay, I could do that. And look, that's a thumbnail, and I can leave it alone. I don't feel this pressure to get any further with it. I'm just looking at the basic shapes and the arrangement of the shapes, the relationships of these shapes, which is why I can then quickly say, all right, well, look, I'm going to use that little area there, and I'm going to have this guy sitting here in the chair. Okay, and there's my table moving back in space, and I've got this other character here sitting opposite them. Okay, and now all of a sudden we're telling a different story. I can show more of their environment. Okay, I can break it up to where maybe this is going to frame this character. I could have a window back here or something and have some high contrast, so that person is silhouetted against that back wall and the light that's coming out from there. And this guy, meanwhile, is going to have a nice shape over here, framing him. Okay, and we can work that out. Maybe I reverse it. Maybe here he's dark on light, but then, oh, and then maybe I could do this. I could lighten that side of the face, right? Catch the light from that window, and that's going to give me an interesting profile to deal with. And then just work out whatever these elements are on the side. Okay, but the thumbnailing is going to make everything different. You can switch it to a vertical and say, okay, what do I want to do with vertical? Okay, wait, hang a second. Let's do this. Let's make the table like that and get one person here. Okay, and there is our legs of our chair underneath there and all that. So top down, okay, so we got one figure here, and we got this other person here. Whoops, like that. All right, so now what happens? We have a totally different story we're telling. Maybe just like hang a cool lamp over here and interrupt some of what's happening with that table. Okay, so that's just not a big boring rectangle. Arrange some cool elements here. This could become part of the story, like what's on the table, what are they talking about, right? Totally different angles, get some diagonals in there for the stuff that's off to the sides of them. Maybe you cast a shadow back here and back here from that light that's in the middle. What am I doing here? I'm playing with composition, same subject every time, two figures sitting at a table. But what I want to do is work out the composition that's telling the story I want. Now, if I were to try and draw these at a scale that was twice as big, right? Automatically, I'm starting to get into details and things I don't care about. And that is not what you want to do. You want to work out compositions as thumbnails. It's going to make your lives a lot easier. All right, so just here's another thing I wanted to show you. When you're thinking about composition, you have to think about the same elements no matter what the scale is. Okay, so if I'm looking at this close-up of this sort of Wonder Woman-like character, this is like a Wonder Woman knockoff. Okay, we'll call her Dunder Woman, whatever. And she's standing here, okay, but I've got an extreme close-up on her face. Well, hang on a minute. I'm still going to think about, okay, stuff like this. I'm still going to think about which direction to move the hair to create interesting shapes in here, right? And around the face. I'm framing the face with the contrast. This shape here, okay, is going to be asymmetrical when compared to this shape over here on this side and this side, right? Or the way that this whole shape comes together. Okay, even though this is a close-up, I'm still trying to avoid boring symmetry, and I'm still thinking about all these action lines and so on. We haven't even gotten into values, but what happens when I do something like this? What happens if I do this? And just grab a bigger brush here for a moment. What happens when I play with shadows? If I do this, I say, all right, so this is in shadow. Okay, her nose is coming, but her eyes are in shadow. This whole, I'm gonna say this whole area is in shadow. Oh, I'm getting the spinning wheel of death, folks. Bear with me. Don't do this to me, Photoshop. I swear. I'll kick you to the curb after 20 years of loving you. Oh dear. All right, hang on a minute. I'll tell you what we're gonna do. We're gonna just say bye-bye, and then pop it right back open again, because that's what I can do. I have the power to do this, folks. So what I was showing you was the shadow on the face, because if I cast the eyes in shadow or part of the shadow in the face, suddenly we're telling a different story than what we were telling before. Is that not true? So check it out. I'll go back to our Wonder Woman here. Dunder Woman. Careful, Kyle. Copyright. Yada, yada, yada. All right, and we're going to throw this shadow on top here, okay? You just go, bam, you are in shadow. Okay. Now, when I do this, okay, all of a sudden, I'm saying, oh, is there something above her? Is something bad about to happen? What's going on? Why is that shadow there? What's that shadow moving across her face? Is Dunder Woman in danger? Okay, or we could do it this way. We could say, all right, kick that shadow up for some lighting from underneath, okay? See what I'm talking about? Totally different story now. There's like some light coming up this direction. All right, anyway, what I was gonna say is, even if it's an extreme close-up, think about all the stuff we already talked about. And then I move to this. I move to a little bit more distance. So now I want to angle this shoulder differently from this shoulder. I want to tilt that head slightly. Okay, I want to make this side of the hair different from this side of the hair. I'm adding some cool asymmetrical balance. Now we change the camera angle. We're looking down slightly at her, okay, for this medium shot. And then we're pulling away a little further. So do something interesting with that lasso. Make that a cool design element of the illustration. Holy cow, now we've got to use some dynamic stuff, right? We're going diagonal, dynamic, 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 totally different, still playing with that lasso. And what happens when we get here? Hero shot, play with the background shapes, right? And place her off on that left third, okay? And then you have some more balance going. Folks, it's time for me to say see you later because you know what? This hour went really fast. I hope you enjoyed this. Come back for more of these. We're going to do these every Friday. And I think next week we're actually switching up the time to 4 p.m. Eastern, so 1 p.m. Pacific. And there's a lot more ground to cover. I'll definitely come back and revisit composition. I'd love to see what kind of questions you have. So please ask me on Twitter. I read that the most, at Kyle T. Webster. Thanks for hanging out. It's really cool that we had Mr. Howard Lyon hanging out. That's amazing. Thanks for being here. And everybody take care. Have a great weekend. And remember to be kind. And I'll see you later next week.